Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Michael Caplan. And Michael Caplan's House of Shape was launched in 2017 with a handbook for ecstatic survival by internationally celebrated Canadian choreographer David Earle. Michael is the House of Shake is Michael's production company, and Michael has a background in theatre and performance and publication design, with, among other things, Spring Journal and books. His engagement with Hillman and Giegerich goes back to 1990, and he has presented at each gathering of the International Society of Psychology since the first ISPD. So welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Michael, the first thing is I haven't had any cigarettes for about 3 or 4 days. So if I just zone out and start staring at the ceiling, you'll have to just keep on talking.
All right. I'll start tap dancing. No, I'm not the tap dancer. I do have dance in my background, but not tap dance. That was Hillman. So.
But, you know, I mean, when we first started talking, I was saying this is not an easy topic for me. You know, the criticism of perhaps a little bit of the critique of Hillman, because there's a couple of people I was thinking, you know, there's a couple of people I'm a bit attached to, and that's Hillman and Bob Dylan. And I've heard that people say Bob Dylan can't sing, and I know that's true. I've heard him out of tune. But I kind of think, you know, the moments of genius come true, and so I want to get on to the Festival of Archetypal Ideas. Was it? Was that what
Psychology? Archetypal, yeah.
So we'll get on to that soon. But I thought first, if maybe you could give a bit of background to, you know, some of your story and the main influences and turning points, and then we'll go on to those topics.
Sure. Well, I come at this a little bit from the side. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not an academic. I always preface my introductions with that. That said, I've been reading and really, I want to say studying. I mean, really intensively working with the material in Hillman and in Giegerich since 1991. I discovered Hillman in 1991, went to the Festival of Archetypal Psychology in 92, heard Giegerich's challenging presentation there, and for some reason really found myself at home in their way of thinking. Now that came from, the path to that. I started in my first love is theater. And so I'm endlessly fascinated by the relationship of the notion of theater and theory, the fact that both of those words come from the same root, which has to do with seeing wonders or seeing the divine, seeing, I can't remember the Greek word, but they both have that same root. And so I came through theater, studied contemporary dance, contact and postmodern dance, performance art. I did corporate and convention special events for a while. I did community-based, collaborative performance events. So I really came at this notion of theater and performance and liveness from a whole bunch of different angles. And it still remains, although it's the thing I actually do the least, it remains the thing that I'm most inspired by or drawn to. But when I was 19 or so, I had some bad LSD experiences, which resulted in a sort of 9-month, with all the symbolism of that, but a 9-month mental health crisis, if you will. I suffered from depersonalization and this feeling that I wasn't in my body, somehow that I was behind myself, and I couldn't understand how there could be room for me, for myself, and in this physical body. I didn't understand the mind-body connection at that most basic kind of, really experiential sort of level. I was really thrown for a loop by this whole experience. And there were some other things that were part of it. I had some what I would consider actually quite a religious experience as part of that as well. Um,
which can be a shock to the system at the same time.
The whole, yeah, I mean, my system was really kind of reeling from it and did for a while. So at the time, because I hadn't really done a lot of reading when I was younger, I always loved books, but I hadn't really read a lot. And so I started picking up books to try to understand what was going on. So I picked up R.D. Laing and the
mm,
anti-psychiatry, and I picked up um, Jung, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, Joseph Campbell talking about mythology. So I was trying to understand these kind of obsessive thoughts that I was having and these conflicts. I was trying to understand them, I guess, conceptually, philosophically, and that went a long way toward
mm,
resolving things. I don't know if I told you last time the story of, I think I did, and I'll tell it really quickly. I had phoned a friend 1 in the morning and said I was feeling really terrible and could he meet me somewhere? And he said, okay. And we met in a little park off the main street here in Toronto, and we talked for maybe an hour. And he said, well, I've got to go to work tomorrow morning. Are you going to be okay? Well, I guess so. Thank you. I didn't feel any different, but I appreciate it. And he said, do you want a hug? And I said, oh, sure, okay. Had a hug, went our separate ways. But what I realized was from that day forward, something changed. So after really 9 months of this, somehow the physical, I realized that the soul, for lack of other terminology, the soul could communicate through the body. So I could have this experience that touched my soul with this other person, despite the fact that I couldn't intellectually understand
mm,
how body and mind go together or what have you. So it started to ground me again and trust that yes, these things, how even if you can't understand how they go together, they do.
mm,
And that is what I now think of as, realism. This is what realism is, understanding how things that don't seem to go together actually do. And that's been somehow that's been what, so very quickly again, scooting forward, a few years later, was going through the next sort of less dramatic crisis, but crisis nonetheless. I picked up, you go through these as you grow up, and I picked up Hillman's Dream in the Underworld. This was in probably 1984 by this time, 85, and
mm,
I put it down on the shelf. It actually scared me.
mm.
I thought, oh my God, somehow I know I'm drawn to this, but I'm not ready for it. 1991, I moved back to Toronto from Montreal where I was living, and somehow picked up a Blue Fire and went, oh, okay, I'm ready for this now. And then I consumed everything I could find of Hillman's. Every book in the bookstores and the libraries, every essay at York University. I used to take the public transit up to York, which took an hour, over an hour at that time. And I'd go day after day and photocopy. I've huge file folders full of things I photocopied from Spring Journal. And that's where I discovered Giegerich. And that's where one thing kind of, the pieces came together, I guess, for me.
Just before we go on to the next step, Michael, what is it about Hillman that you like? What did you get from all of that?
The feeling I got from him, it was actually a feeling, and it was something I'd never experienced with any other writer as much as I had enjoyed reading other writers, was that the whatever phenomenon he was talking about seemed to come alive. And I had this feel, he wrote about the gods and excuse me, I had this feeling that the gods were pleased, that they were up there going, finally, somebody's talking about us with appreciation for the for the wholeness that they represent. Um, so it was really, he would pick up a topic of, you know, the child, or parapsychology, or at one point he wrote about ceilings, the masturbation inhibition. These
Mm,
really particular topics, and yet in each case, I felt like, wow, somehow that he's touching the soul or the something about the reality of this phenomenon. And so that was really what it was. And no one else, in no one else's hands did topic seem to come
I'm
alive
alive.
the way
Yeah.
they did with him.
I mean, the term he uses sometimes is the poetic basis of the mind, but I think that
Yes.
that comes through, doesn't it?
It's so, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
His whole emphasis in the way he revisioned, if you will, or reconceived imagination as being something much more than certainly visual, but also something much more even than what, in his preferred term, imaginal, in the sense that it's really the whole ground of consciousness. We imagine ourselves into being. The I, as he said, the I is a fantasy of the soul. Um, the way he ended revisioning psychology with a processional exit, and all these figures that he had been writing about all took their leave one by one to
yeah.
make room for whatever would come up next. So it was that strange combination of it seems so ungrounded. It seems so um, well, his fantasy, right, was his word. He loved
Yeah.
that word fantasy. But the notion that we are living these fantasies or these dreams, and that they actually, not in a bad sense, but that this is what structures our reality for human beings, is these fictions or these fantasies or these dreams in which we exist as we go about our lives in the world.
You know what? The one way I might describe it is that it's like the return. What I get from Hillman is the return of the gods and goddesses. Like you can't go, you can't read any of Hillman without Hera coming in or Dionysus or Athena or I don't know whether you can go more than three lines basically without someone coming in, and it's kind of like the return to Greece, the return of the gods and goddesses. It's a big part of that whole
Yeah, yeah.
thing.
Well, and it was this notion, I guess, that he takes from Jung, and of course, Giegerich and Hillman both consider themselves true heirs of Jung. There are certain things that they take from him that form the basis of their own positions. But one of the things he took was this idea of psychological polytheism, the
Mm,
idea that there isn't one governing voice,
mm,
but that there's this sort of sometimes cacophony, sometimes civil war, sometimes democratic consensus
mm,
between these aspects of ourselves.
mm,
And even historically, the idea that at different times and for different cultures, these gods or those gods are the relevant ones and are absolutely real for that situation. They
yeah.
are what informs the depth of that situation in reality. And so it was that idea of I guess the polytheism that was
Theism
very
of that, yeah. But the dream in the underworld was a bit of a darker, like I must
yeah,
say, out of my reading of Hillman, that's one that I'm a little bit, well, it's not my favorite. It's probably the bluntest way of saying it, but it's a bit darker, isn't it? It's a bit,
it is. Yeah, yeah. When I finished reading it, I had this real initiatory dream where I went down into there
yeah,
was lead and the whole thing. But
yeah,
it's this idea that, and the way he talks about the Greek underworld is that it's the same as the everyday world,
mm,
only without life. So
mm,
it's itself as an image. So the idea of being able to see what's happening in the real world as
mm,
if it were an image, and then to read it, to interpret it the way you might interpret a dream, in order to understand the logic, in a Giegerichian word, the logic or the sense of what's happening in that dream. Hillman at one point says, to look at events as if they were dream images. And Giegerich talks about the sand tray therapy model that's used in Jungian psychology, where people take, the toys that are there and place them into a picture in the sand tray and then interpret that or interact, respond to that in some way. That's Giegerich's model of culture, really. That the whole thing is a big sand tray that we are all involved with. And I don't think Hillman would disagree with that at all.
Well, on a personal level, when you started reading Giegrich, what what was it that it did for you? I mean, what did you get from
The way I've often described it is Hillman took me 90% of the way.
it? Yeah.
So his to me was this great revolt.
Mm,
But Giegerich gave it that little push that sent it 100%. And once it was 100%, it's in motion. It's kind of like once you give it that push, you've got this sort of conceptual, this sort of methodological way of thinking about things that's in motion.
mm,
Um, so Giegerich to me was the revolution. Hillman was the revolt.
mm,
Giegerich was the revolution. And
mm,
there's a story of Louis the 16th, I guess it was, and during the beginning of the French Revolution, and he's come home from hunting and writes in his diary the word nothing, meaning he didn't get anything on the hunt. And
mm,
his one of his counselors comes to him and says, "Sire, there's an uprising in Paris." And he says, "Is it a revolt?" And he says, "It's worse, sire. It's a revolution."
mm,
So once it's a revolution, nothing is the same after that. And so
mm,
for me, that's Gierig represented that revolution, taking Hillman, what I felt and sensed and what I thought was implicit in Hillman, taking that idea all the way.
mm.
Um, and really looking at it in terms of contemporary reality. So where Hillman was talking about polytheism and the gods, Giegrich was talking about said that's all absolutely legitimate and relevant, but it's not where we are today. We don't live in Greece. We don't live with Zeus. We don't live with Hera. Much as on a personal level we can use these images and relate to these images and grow through these images. I think it's not what's defining the culture and the historical moment. And that is the
That that
monarchy.
that speaks to you deeply.
Yeah, well, because to me, again, it's realism, right? It's like,
Mm,
where are we really? What's really happening here?
mm, yeah.
And Hillman's the polytheism prepares the ground for thinking about that. But then you have to look at, and he said that all the time too,
Mm,
which God in particular needs the attention now?
mm. So,
And
so how would you answer that?
to me, it's the monotheistic God. It's the God that both connects and divides Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And I think that really is the God that we have to wrestle with. And yeah, I'll leave it at
Yeah.
that. I'll just say Hillman had this running, what he called the running engagement with Christianity. And
Mm,
Christianity for him, or monotheism, was because he was opposed to it in this with his defense of polytheism.
mm,
He tended to look, in my view, looked at monotheism unpsychologically. So it was like he looked at anything else psychologically, but when it came to that,
mm.
he couldn't do it. It was moralized against, it was considered negative. And his own teaching
Well,
said,
maybe even, as a fan of Hillman, as you know, but I would say maybe even a little bit of hatred towards monotheism.
yeah, yeah.
It
And
wouldn't
for
be
me
too
at that
strong a
time,
word. Yeah.
yeah. For me at the time, that was also very useful and bracing and
Mm,
interesting. I loved what he said, but I just don't think in the end, I don't think we can stay there. I think we have
mm,
to go further than that. At least if you're taking that approach, if you're taking a psychological, phenomenological approach.
mm,
In his view, phenomenology, this is a direct quote, you take a thing for what it is and let it talk.
mm,
You don't moralize about, and at the end of the quote, you don't moralize about it. You don't freeze part of it into negativity and say, oh, that's negative and bad. We don't like that.
mm.
You
Yeah.
have to accept the whole phenomenon and
mm,
try to understand what it's saying to you, what it
mm.
or us, as the case may be. And Giegerich did that to me. Giegerich, and in a really shocking way. I mean, he looked at technology and the nuclear bomb and the even advertising as, in a sense, expressions of or further operations of the what is also in Christianity, in the Christian God. I don't have to get into all that, but it's but it was a really uh, frightening but exciting way of thinking that I felt actually brought these huge, almost unthinkable phenomena within the realm of psychological consideration.
I might see Giegrich, when Hillman talks about the North and the South, like
Hmm.
from, and I'm not really qualified to go into the intricacies of, the philosophy between the two. But, so I would have to say that from up front as well. But I might
Yeah.
say when Hillman talks about the North, and I see Giegrich, and maybe behind him I might see Hegel a little, you know,
And Heidegger.
and Heidegger, and then with and that kind of intellect of the North, maybe, which is also sometimes in Jung very strong, in terms of his.
Yeah.
And then we were talking when we were talking just before we started. I was saying with Hillman and Thomas More, I see these kind of two half Italian brothers who are more maybe in the Neoplatonic tradition, and there's been that long line, and in the Neoplatonic tradition, there's that kind of, there's numbers and astrology and Pythagoras and
Yeah.
Italian exuberance, if
Yeah.
I can put it
Yeah.
that way,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
think what you're saying, what I got from you from talking to you, is it's kind of like this. I don't know. Maybe if we could talk, and Hillman said Italy is anima country. I remember him saying that at one occasion. But it's kind of like, it seems to me that there's something about the animus, the intellect from Giegrich, that you're responding to. The I mean, would you say we could go too far? I mean, I know this is a simplistic way of saying it, but we could go too far into the anima, the soul and its depth. We can go kind of over to that side too much. Is that kind of one thing you might say?
I I guess it's not. I mean, I personally don't tend to use the terms anima and animus myself, and just in my own thinking about it. But I guess right. People can maybe each of the sides have their own dangers, which is not. You don't necessarily want to balance them out in sort of equalized stasis or anything, but that they respond to each other. So you can become wrapped up in these fantasies, truly fantasies, these kind of ideological or uh, theoretical um,
Or mythological
or
fantasies?
mythological, yes, in the woods, in that way, and you need that the animus to bring clarity to it, to define
Mm.
where you are and what it is. And again, that was always in Hillman. So in each case, these things are both, they're in each other. It's that yin yang, the Taoist kind of, this
Yeah.
may seem more like this now, and that it may seem more like that, but at a different moment or at a different.
So that's the Hegelian dialectic or something, is it?
It goes back, I think it goes back to Heraclitus or Heraclitus, as some people say. And um, Hegel certainly said there's nothing in my philosophy which is not in Heraclitus. So he was very much coming from that tradition of trying to understand the relationship between change and stability, between the fact that the river is never the same twice, but it's still the river.
mm,
So how do we think those two, and so Hegel was certainly dealing with that. Um, Hillman is dealing with that. I can find quote after quote where he's talking about the alchemical conjunction of the conjunctio and how it's not a balanced mixture. It's not an equalized, stable sort of thing, but a continual unbalancing of one side by the other in order that thinking can be in motion and respond to whatever it's encountering, I guess.
mm.
Um, so yeah, does that sort of,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I think like um, one thing I would say, I mean, if I'm just kind of forthright for a second, when I uh, have started to read a little bit of Giegrich, when I hear the logical life of the soul or the logo, like I understand what you're saying. It's kind of like even with I don't know eros, like to me, and I know this is taking us down another path a little, but if I read the myth of analysis, I think I think Hillman said it himself. His main myth is that myth of eros and psyche. And I see a
Mhm.
lot of eros in Hillman, the way he writes, his passion, the mysterious creative force of eros or something like that. And I respond to eros in the sense that logos can seem a little bit old hat. Like there's one of your compatriots, more from the popular culture, Jordan Peterson speaks about
Oh yeah.
logos a lot. You know, when I hear logos, I think, oh, we've done that. You know, we did that for a long, long time or something. And you know, because I barrack for the right wing intuitive sort, the not the right wing, the
Yeah.
right brained
Yeah.
intuitives
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
whatever, that you know, there's room for eros and psyche to come back into the mix. But I also get that. I also understand that what you're saying is that what's probably a better conception is that logos and eros and psyche, you know, the balance in the mix and how we need to have them all. I mean, could you respond to that?
To me, the eros, in terms thinking about what is psychology and what
Mm,
is this particular approach that's so
mm,
unique, I think, to Giegerich and Hillman and coming up again through Jung, but um, is that you can't, first of all, you can't take anything literally. So eros is not only that which appears as eros, as erotic. There's, we see an erotic anima attachment to the most arcane conceptual ideas, some of the political ideas that are, going around right now, all these, the erotic attachment to these ideas is really, it's dangerous in a way, right? It's dangerous. And because
can you give us an example in particular?
it gets really complicated because, but let's risk it and talk about sex and gender for a moment, right?
Yeah,
There are clearly changes happening. There are all kinds of reasons for those changes. I myself have always been, involved in gay rights. I was a teenager. Our little group of friends campaigned for the first what we call the gay straight alliance or the gay what do they call it, the gay liaison for our high school. So I was volunteering for Toronto's Body Politic, which was a gay rights, gay liberation
yeah,
magazine. For decades I've been in kind of, and in my personal life I've gone all over the place. So
mm,
um but with the rise of what's being called gender ideology,
mm.
um, coming from the left that more or less
Supported.
belonged to and
Yeah.
supported, and was supported by in my
Mm,
own experiments in life. But there's become a real closed down, ideologically conformist, intolerant, essentially unthinking attachment to certain ideas like trans women are women or whatever the slogan is that one, and again, I think these are super complex issues, and the difference between a gay drag queen and a heterosexual cross-dresser, as we use, the term, and these
Yeah.
are all things that need to be talked about. You can't talk about it if the intellectual climate is erotically fixated on certain strict
Ideological framework,
ideological, yeah,
which
slogans.
has
Yeah.
no porousness in the walls of.
And again, is not realistic, is not reality. I'm always looking back. Well, um, so that's, for example, and there you have eros attached to this seemingly, this actually conceptual
Yeah.
structure. So how are eros and logos related there? It's very, it's slippery. And I don't think you can take logos or logic even literally in the sense of conventional logic or, the logic of non-contradiction, mathematical logic, that kind of thing. So Giegerich, I was very aware when he used that word, the soul's logical life, when he gave that title to his book, that a lot of people were going to react very negatively to that. What do
Mm.
you mean the soul's not logical? The soul, but what he's saying is not that the soul conforms or should conform to conventional logic, but that we should become aware of what the logic of the soul is. So we can easily speak about the logic of a particular dream. Oh, in this dream, my boss plays this role and, my uncle plays that role and they're related in this way. That's not difficult for us to think about that, the logic of a dream in that way. So all he's really saying by using the word logic or logos is we must look at the logic of the reality in which we find ourselves. And again, that is not different from what Hillman was saying when he said the fantasy in which we live. It's the logic of the fantasy in which we live.
I know this, and it's such a big area, but one thing I've got from Hillman, let's say, is that if you look at Apollo and Hermes and Dionysus and Athena and Hera, in a way, they all have their own logic. Like Dionysian logic is not quite the same as Apollonic logic or whatever.
Yes.
And it's kind of like, perhaps for me, and this is where, I could have a negative bias as well, quite strongly, because I might see logic as often fitting into an Apollo's uh,
Right.
domain, if you want to put it that way.
Right.
Um, and the fact that there's a multitude of logics. Like it might be very hard for us to understand Dionysian logic in our kind of present, official society or whatever.
And they have the other thing that Hillman always brings out is that these figures always exist in pairs, at least. They always exist in relationships. So it's not just the logic of Dionysus, it's the logic of Dionysus and Apollo and their relationship, or the logic of Hades and Zeus, or the logic, you know what I mean? So Pan and the nymphs in that beautiful essay that he did on panic.
Mm.
It's the logic of a relationship. Logic, logos, and that's why Giegrich focuses on that word, is because logic is about relationships.
Right.
What is the relationship between these phenomena or between these structures?
Mm.
Whereas to not think about logic, it becomes easier to get seduced in a way by reified images. And the
What,
notion of
what, what
logic
is
is
what is a reified image?
reified, like solidified, solid
Fixed,
seeming images.
getting a little fixed.
Yeah, get fixed. Yes, exactly. So a
Mm.
fixed kind of ideas, fixed ideas. So if you think of logic, you're not thinking in terms of fixed ideas, you're thinking about relationships, which is why Hegel writes about logic.
Mm.
It's the logic of how, in his case, the logic of how thinking works, which is the science of logic. This is how
Mm,
thinking works. This is related to that. This is, um,
mm, yeah. And I just want to go back to, when you were talking about the left as we know it now, you were a lefty, right? I was a lefty. And then we've reached this, perhaps a few of us have reached this strange place as, gee, it's a bit hard to recognize the left these days. It's maybe changed a little bit. Like sometimes in its ideology, it can seem a little authoritarian. Like when I was 16 or 17, all the authoritarianism was over there on the right, and the
right,
left, I thought they were
right,
liberals. And,
right,
you know,
right, right. I mean, and that was partly, in a way, our own bias or naivete about the historical left, which of course has
yes,
been wildly totalitarian.
yes,
Whatever great things it has also accomplished, the unions and all these incredible developments that have come out of the left. But it has also got this history of
uh,
real totalitarianism. I mean, murderous totalitarianism. My mom, I often talk about I read about dialectics, or I think about this word dialectical, and I don't really like technical words, but you can't really do without that word. It's a very, very
yeah,
useful. But in my own life, I've had these dichotomies that I've had to think about dialectically. And so one of them was that my father was Jewish, what
yeah,
I always call a proud but non-observant Jew. He was very staunchly proud, grew up in the streets of Montreal, the Jewish kids fighting with the Catholic kids and what have you, had a broken nose to show for it.
yeah.
Staunch, proudly Jewish, but non-observant. He was in,
Mm,
I still to this day have his tarot cards. I stole his I Ching, um, you know. And my mom, on the other hand, grew up. She was born in 1928 in Germany, Gentile in Germany, and so grew up under Nazism. Her brother and her father were in the army. Her father was an officer. She was in the girls' Hitler Youth, the Bund Deutsche Mädel, as everyone was. And so when the war was over, then they had to live through East German communism. And her sister distributed some kind of questionable satirical magazine or something. I don't know what it was. And they had to leave East Germany. So she had the experience both of, the Nazi regime and of the East German regime. And then she came to Canada really to get away from all of that and met my dad, who was a Jewish jazz drummer. And
lucky she's still not around now because she might think Trudeau is belonging to one of those. Some...
well, it's we won't talk about Trudeau.
Anyway, sorry, keep on going.
No, no, yeah. So and the story was always that the first person who welcomed her into my dad's family was an uncle by marriage who had been in Dachau concentration camp and who was German, always felt connected to the Germans, hated the Nazis obviously, but still felt himself to be German, and so he welcomed my mom into the family, and so I had this sort of dialectic in my own history that I've had to think
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. So therefore, that whole way of thinking becomes a way of dealing with opposites and
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
yeah,
And
and
then
a
that
way of working with
mind-body
them.
kind of, that
Yeah.
mind-body sort of breakdown I had at a certain point.
Mm.
And because I am very intellectually inclined,
Yeah.
as much as I also love theater and singing country music and all of that, and really stupid comedy, um, so I want to always understand these things on that level. I want to understand,
Yes.
well, how can I think about this reality?
Mm.
How can I make a place for this reality? How can I change my thinking to
Mm.
catch up with, in a favorite Giegerich phrase, to catch up with the actual reality?
Mm. Okay, gotcha. And I found it interesting the way you were talking about Eros, because I must admit, I've often thought of I mean, I know we're circling around this a little, but there's a lot of, for me at least, deep kind of topics. Anyway, they're very deep topics. But
Yeah.
Eros, on one level, I see it as a mysterious, well, it's love at the end of the day, right? Which is a mysterious creative force which kind of awakens the soul. So it's an alive force, uh, but I like this idea of a kind of contaminated eros that you were talking about. Or, to me, maybe when we fall from the experience of eros into ideology, that people can be swept away by their erotic attachments, if you want to put it that way, which can
Well,
have a very
Hillman,
non-intellectual flavor.
yeah, yeah. Hillman said, if you want to know where psyche is, where soul is, look where eros is. That it compels you, which fascinates you, which pulls you back to it again and again. That's where soul is. So he and Giegrich will never disagree with that. Again, on all these fundamental questions, they don't disagree.
Yeah.
So fundamental questions of the psychological approach, they don't
Mm,
disagree. So
mm,
where eros is, that's where you'll find soul.
right.
Um, that's why I think that feeling function, that sense of where, to use the Jungian term, right? Feeling function, where the eros is, is the important thing. And then to bring, in a way, to bring logos to that.
Yeah.
Hillman always said, the emotion is to be articulated into the image that contains and occasions the emotion. So you
Mm,
have, and I think his book on emotion, his PhD thesis on emotion was his first book is just absolutely brilliant in that respect because what he's showing is that emotion is always part of a picture, a fantasy, a story in which you are one of the players. And
mm,
that's what occasions the emotion. So you'll never deal with the emotion unless you deal with that fantasy or that dream or that meaning structure, to put
yeah.
it in a really neutral term, that meaning structure
Yeah.
in which and as which you live.
Mm,
And then the emotion is articulated into the image, and then along comes Giegrich and says, okay, and now the image has to be articulated into the idea or into the meaning, into the logos that's actually at work in this real situation.
the intellectual work that's required, and perhaps it's a little bit in vogue. There's like what is it? The mountain of the spirit and the intellect has been left for the valley of the soul sometimes, but uh, not it shouldn't be like they should feed each other, which
And
is another way of saying,
they are in each other. They're not, the naturalistic way of thinking is that here's one and here's the other.
yeah,
But the dialectical way of thinking is that they are in each other all the
yeah,
time.
yeah,
Every time there's emotion, there's thinking going on there, whether
mm,
you're aware of it or not.
yeah,
And even if you think you're thinking very hard, you may very well be following emotion rather than reason.
mm, mm.
So they're always
That's
part
good.
of each other. And again, it's if I kind of look this way, I'll see it. If I look that way, I'll see or look at it from this way, or look at it from that way.
Yeah, that's
See
good.
one side or the other.
Yeah,
They're
that's
there
good.
to me. They're always interpenetrated.
Mm. And Michael, just like I know we're getting towards the time maybe, but it's kind of like I've always been asking people lately about this time. Maybe we touched on it a little before. Um, Navigating through these unusual times that we live in, and I understand. I'd just like to go just a little bit back into this. How you were a lefty. How have you changed recently? And how have you changed your thinking? And what are the most important things to you in the present environment in order to navigate through?
I've become, I mean, one thing that certainly going to set off a lot of people's um, uh, warning bells or what have you, is that I've become a very unequivocal Zionist. I've become very, very pro-Israel, which happened. I always describe my journey as I was a more or less typical leftist who believed a lot of the criticisms of Israel that come from the left.
Mm.
I didn't, however, I wasn't therefore anti-Zionist in that I never thought, oh, well, Israel shouldn't exist or any of that kind of thing, because many of my relatives were very involved in it, and I could see the value of it and the importance. And I knew, you know, I know what the, I knew about the Holocaust from a very early age, so I
Yeah.
knew how, um, how massive this issue is psychologically, if it can lead to that kind of extreme. So I was never anti-Israel in that sense, but I believed a lot of the criticisms that come from the
Mm.
left about Israel.
Yeah.
Um, for me, certain warning bells started to go off when I was engaging with leftist friends, artist friends, people like that on the subject, and they would say things to me that suddenly started to seem, you know, these weren't radical leftist people. These were very much everyday kind of, and a lot of the things they said started to seem very questionable. Oh, that's no. And so I started to look more deeply into the issue, and probably around 2015, you know, maybe 10 years ago, I started to look into it more seriously, and did tons of research, really thought about it psychologically, and I have come to this very clear position now, that I'm simply pro-Israel. I mean, the one can critique this or that political thing or this or that military thing, but none of them amount to anything like the standard. And this has become such a huge cultural phenomenon. Israel
Mm.
genocide, Israel apartheid, all this stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it inverts reality ultimately. Like every anti-Jewish myth, every anti-Jewish trope in history, essentially, it's taken the reality, reversed it in order to blame Jews of the worst possible thing at that particular historical moment. So, what is the worst possible thing at this historical moment? Colonialism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. What is Israel accused of? Colonialism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing. It's a setup, and it's been going on. I mean, it's been psychologically, it's a long time in coming, a long time, very, very deeply rooted. Um, Very politically useful for certain people, which ultimately it is always. Ruth Wiss says anti-Semitism, politics of deflection. So it's like, don't look at what I'm doing, which fits everything I'm saying they're doing, because there's this presumption, this underlying prejudice about Jewish evil. So
Uh,
deep, deep,
I
deep stuff, and very contentious. I mean, I've lost a number of friends over this. So
yeah. I mean, you know, obviously, is a deep and complicated topic, but it's kind of like what surprised me at the beginning of all of this is that back if we go back a little to Bob Dylan and all those days, I think we were speaking about that before. It seemed to
yeah,
me that Woody Guthrie and who was it, Pete Seeger, and there was this kind of uh, nice left, you know,
yeah, yeah,
uh, lovely left or whatever. And then all of a sudden, there are orthodoxies that have built up that cannot
yeah.
be challenged. It seems to me that you can't step out of those orthodoxies. So if you have something which is a little bit different, or you feel strongly, or you have reasons to believe and intellectual understandings, then it's become very difficult to have those incorporated.
Become very censorious, very, very dismissive, bullying. I mean, people. Just reading about this professor at a university nearby, near Toronto, and how he's lost his job, essentially been hounded out of his profession. He isn't even Jewish, but he said some things against Hamas. why it should be controversial to say something against the equivalent of Al Qaeda and the Taliban.
mm.
I don't know, but that's where we are. So 2 years on, he's still fighting in the courts. He had, his reputation's been destroyed. He's like, well, what am I going to do now? I don't even have a job. Why? Because somebody in the department managed to take something he said, spin it a particular way, or use it, say, oh, it fits this new category of evil, social evil, and the effects are
He's
devastating.
not towing the party line, which is kind of connecting back to the Eastern Europe you mentioned a little earlier, if you ask me,
Yeah,
because
right.
if you don't toe the party line, you're in trouble.
And that's the opposite of psychology. That's the opposite. The spirit of being in that, and this, of course, has affected the profession of psychology as well. I follow a group of critical psychologists who are challenging a lot of the orthodoxies building up now around gender ideology, around Israel, around these various topics that are real hot button, in topics that psychologically are being used to divide people. They're being used politically to divide people
Yeah.
rather than being, and that's the opposite of what's supposed to happen in a therapy room or in a setting where you sit with these things and understand, and why is this coming and why is that, so.
And also, as someone said, I think it was Michael Van Adams, said, in some ways, usurping the role of the unconscious. Because if you're in a therapeutic environment, it's what dreams you have and what those dreams are saying to you and how you're taking those dreams. So
Right.
a certain level of neutrality
Yeah.
perhaps uh, might be required in order to let that
Of
nature
course. Of course.
heal.
I mean, that used to be the place where you could go to the
Yeah.
ideal was you could go to the therapist and say anything.
Mm.
And they would say, okay, let's sit with that let's talk about that. Let's think about that. You know,
I
um,
think there's this phenomena that, this is just an intuitive, maybe I'm having a guess or whatever, but it seems to me that there's many people from the left that have migrated a bit more to the center and sometimes
of
even
course,
further. And that in this reaction to some recent election that was had in the US, uh, that people haven't still quite recognized perhaps how many people have migrated across, you know,
yeah, yeah.
because
Well, and I think the majority of people in general are
mm,
not obsessed with ideological issues. Yes, they'll have a position on this or that. Yes, there'll be certain things that are particularly important to them, what have you.
yeah,
Um, but in general, people are not obsessed with these. So we're really being fed this stuff to
mm,
push us this way and push us that way.
mm,
And it is all very well thought out. It's very deliberate. It's very, the people who are doing it are profiting fabulously from it.
mm,
And the regular everyday people who don't want to be fighting,
mm,
are kind of, well, where do I go? Where do I turn? Everybody's looking to fight with everybody. And,
mm,
yes, I'm willing to fight it for certain things, yes, but I don't want to. It's not, I don't want to constantly be in these conflicts. And I mean, how does that come back to Giegerich and to psychology and all that? Well, it has to do with we're in this historical moment where we're identity itself has been dissolved, has been attacked, has been questioned, undermined, a necessary, Giegerich would say, a necessary psychological challenge, a process somehow that the soul itself is is handing to us and saying, well, here you go, deal with this. Much like my own personal breakdown. It was the soul going, no, the way you're thinking and living is not big enough. It's not capacious enough. It's not deep enough for the reality. So I'm going to pathologize, as
mm.
Hillman, as Hillman said, going to pathologize, and you're going to have a breakdown in order because you have to deal with this thing.
Yeah,
And so
that's
I
good.
that's
That's
the
good, Michael.
and
And
it's
and and it
it's
also,
Jungian, right? It's the telos
mm,
within the pathology. And so
yeah,
there's a telos within this pathology that we're going through about identity and how do I identify with the collective or am I an individual? And these
yeah,
absolutely profound questions.
yeah,
But the way to avoid them is to fixate on an ideology, to hunker down in a bunker,
Yeah.
to close yourself off.
The need for certainty when the
Yes.
breadth and the height and the depth of being able to deal with the dialectic, to use the
Yeah.
jargon. But
And I get it. It's who would want to deal with these, to try and wrestle with and think through these social breakdowns and give the other side a voice and say, well, what are they, even if I don't agree with what they're proposing, what's the impulse behind it? Is there something there that I need to take into account? Or
yeah,
um, I
that's good.
I have this phrase of the challenge that we're facing in our time, and perhaps it's a 2,000 year long challenge, that
Mm,
kind of started with the Greeks and the Hebrews and all that, but learning to count to one. I think that's where we are. I think we're being challenged by psyche itself to learn to count to one.
mm,
What is one? Is it everything? Is it internally divided? I mean, I am body and soul. I am material and immaterial, but I am
mm,
one. So, how do we think of identity, and this is also why Hegel is so relevant to these contemporary questions, because his thinking about identity and difference is so
mm.
sophisticated and
That's good.
profound.
That's great. Well, thank you very much for sharing all of that. And
Thank you, John. Thank you for asking me.
it's been a pleasure talking to you.
And you. All the best. Happy New Year.